Hello, this is a talk organized by the CANactions International Architecture Festival. My name is Janette Kim, and I'm going to give a talk about the use of board games as public engagement tools. Actually, I'm going to go back to the title page there. So I'm an architect based in San Francisco. I am an assistant professor at California College of the Arts, where I direct a research lab called Urban Works Agency. And I also have a practice called All of the Above. Um, and generally speaking, I work on the way that climate change and social justice interact with each other. And over the past couple of years, I've been making a series of board games that play out the way that climate change impacts equity and ownership and social interactions within cities. And I do this in part to create a tool for public engagement, but I also do it because I'm interested in the fact that architects build models, but so do economists and ecologists. And I think board games act as a kind of bridge between those different ways of thinking. Um, so today I'll give you an overview of two board games that I've been designing and playing out. But I think to start off, I wanted to give you a bit of insight into some work that I did during a design competition around climate change and resilience. And I think it might help to give a bit of background um, to some of the ways in which social justice is engaged within climate change responses today. So maybe we could start off with that, and then I'll move more into the board games in a moment. So this design competition was called the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge, and it was held between 2017 and 2018, basically organized by city and state agencies across the San Francisco Bay Area. They invited about 10 international design teams to make proposals that would make the area more resilient to sea level rise and other climate related risks. So our team, and the members are mentioned right here, our team was called the All Bay Collective and combined a really broad range of different kinds of expertise, from landscape architecture to urban economics to public advocacy and housing policy to biology, and on and on. And then we worked very closely with community-based organizations mostly in Deep East Oakland, as well as many city and state agencies that were involved in that area. So our focus was to spend time with the San Leandro Bay. And this is an estuary that you can see here that's in the East Bay of San Francisco Bay. And this connects East Oakland, Alameda Island over here, Alameda Bay, and Bay Farm Island over here. And it was just a really extraordinary place to work because of the way that social equity issues were so closely interwoven with ecological and kind of infrastructural questions. So the whole neighborhood is basically like torn apart by these different infrastructural lines. It's home to a really sort of thriving wetland, but it's also really susceptible to coastal flooding, and actually to very far inland flooding due to the way that rivers work, the canals work, and to the kind of high groundwater table. So the risk is very distributed. And then the neighborhood as well is really kind of struggling to overcome a long and deep legacy of discriminatory planning practices and housing loan practices, and a lot of challenges of deindustrialization that have taken a lot of jobs away from the area. So there's a lot of poverty and environmental health burdens in the area. At the same time that actually the neighborhood is also really pressured by gentrification forces. And this is really exaggerated by the fact that these sports teams have left the stadium, and a lot of people are speculating about the future development of this site. And then maybe most importantly, there's a very deep legacy of community-based activism and governance in Oakland. And this reaches back to the era of the shipbuilders unions, to Black Panthers, which were based originally in Oakland, really founded in Oakland, and extends to things that we see today, like this group called Planting Justice, which is a permaculture nonprofit. So in response to this really fantastically rich set of conditions, our design proposal was what I'll show you very briefly right now, which was called the Estuary Commons. And we called it this to try to emphasize the idea that resources and spaces across this area needed to be owned and managed in coordination with a much bigger public than is kind of working today. And that really only this kind of sharing of resources would be enough to kind of tackle the challenge of climate change. The part of the project that I was especially most involved in focused, as I said, on the questions of social justice and the need to generate wealth in this area, even before some of the bigger infrastructural changes around climate change might start to come in. So we looked at ways to kind of keep investment local to the area. We looked at forms of cooperative ownership, such as a community land trust. And we looked at ways that these kinds of infrastructures could really sort of help support a social network, a kind of social infrastructure that makes the neighborhood more resilient. And most importantly, creates financial stability among existing residents so that they can stay there in place as things change. And then perhaps with that kind of layer, that kind of foundation, we started to look much further into the future and looked at the creation of floating neighborhoods or tidal lagoons that can start to accommodate this influx of water into the neighborhood, while the existing residents can kind of thrive in this neighborhood. So that was our project, and what you're looking at right now is just the website for that competition. But I also wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about what's really hard about a process like this. I think we were really excited about this design process, about the design proposals that we're making, but we also saw a lot of challenges. When this competition was opened, a number of community-based organizations protested the competition, and they were really frustrated with the idea that resilience was, in their eyes, just a kind of smoke screen for development. And I think very rightfully so. And there's a lot of distrust and a lot of frustration with the way that planning processes like this are happening. So I wanted to take a moment and just think a little bit about this theme, this kind of trend of resilience, or this movement of resilience, and understand how we might be able to do it differently. And one of the kind of like rallying cries that we often hear about resilience is that it's a win-win, right? So for those of you who might be less familiar with the idea of resilience, the idea, especially in planning circles, is this goal that for society to be capable of withstanding the kind of catastrophe of climate change, cities have to be retooled to absorb shocks and then keep operating in the meantime. So this is a kind of elasticity that would require really big moves, like new economic incentives, new policy directives, new infrastructures and landscapes. And then the theory goes, right, that this ability to absorb risk and not just deflect it is a kind of win. Right, so for resilience proponents, this is a kind of rhetoric that's pulled from game theory. And for them and for us, I should say, it serves as a kind of tool for coalition building, right? So it draws in skeptics with a language that echoes the kind of logic of economic growth that we've also seen in the movement of sustainability. This language of the win-win also reflects the kind of compulsion in neoliberal governance to quantify values like equity and environment always through the lens of profit. So, I think what's odd here is that the term win-win aspires to generate kind of power for wholesale change, but while using the language of business as usual, right? So it's kind of reaching out from one interest group to another, but without sort of translating its own jargon. So, I do want to say that I think in many ways, resilience has been incredibly useful for city planners, for members of the public, to mobilize spending around climate change, right? To be aware of the risks of climate and other kind of risks that we all face. And I think it's paved the path to really extend across traditional disciplinary boundaries, cultural boundaries. And so I'm very excited about the movement in many ways. But I think we all have to be very aware of the critiques of resilience, right? That in a way, this theory requires the most vulnerable to absorb risk and absorb it rather than kind of change it, right? And it requires them, the most vulnerable, to absorb these risks without challenging the kinds of disinvestment, the kinds of exclusions that made them so insecure in the first place. Um, so I think a more kind of productive, a more deeply kind of rooted version of resilience would in fact also acknowledge that sometimes there are losers, sort of regrettably, sometimes even deliberately, but sort of unfortunately, there are losers as well as winners. And I think a failure to kind of daylight those difficulties, to daylight those conflicts, would simply leave those issues forgotten or kind of push decision making into some kind of smoke-filled room, right? So what I'm interested in doing with these board games and with my design work is to try to reveal those conflicts, to open them up and expose them to a greater, more inclusive kind of debate that hopefully can actually allow us to get at some of the more deep-seated issues behind resilience and not just expect constant bouncing back from the most vulnerable. So this series of board games that I've created over the past couple of years, including one that I made for the design competition I just mentioned, really sort of comes in with this set of interests. I've somewhat ironically called this series of board games WinWin, to try to acknowledge this idea that there are also like lose-lose and win-lose tensions within climate thinking or futures thinking. All of these models kind of test out relationships between sea level rise and social justice issues like gentrification and displacement. And as I said, I think of them as kind of tools for this kind of a different kind of discussion among broader publics. So I will show you some of them. This is a kind of overview of some of the WinWin games, but I'll dive into two of them. One that's called In It Together that I created for the competition that I just described, and the second called Brighter Town, which focuses more on kind of social entanglements and interdependencies. All right, so let's start off with the first one. This is called In It Together. And I basically created this game in parallel with the design process of this competition. So we use the game to kind of inform our own design thinking and to build trust and to host communication with our various partners. And then after the competition has been over, I've also been kind of taking the game out into the world and playing it with the various partners as well. So I will say that, you know, in light of some of the difficulties that the design challenge had, I think luckily we were able to form really trusting and productive relationships with community members in East Oakland, in part because we made it, I think, clear that we weren't interested in creating a single fixed master plan, but instead our team's focus was to offer tools that various members of the public can use as they move forward, as they kind of steward their own relationship to climate resilience. And the game was one of those tools. So we started this process by handing out blank player cards to the kind of team members that I'm showing right here. And this includes like community members like the East Oakland Coalition, like the Oakland Climate Action Coalition. It also involves city agencies like Rapid Transit, Parks, and Oakland City Planning. So we handed out these stakeholder cards and we asked everyone to describe their priorities. We then looked back on the game and defined the characters of the players to reflect those stakeholders. And then we returned back to the next stakeholder meeting with a series of pieces that you see here, which are basically adaptation pieces And they range from tidal ponds and living levees to policies like things that support affordable housing or that could build a community land trust. And then our partners used a map that we also brought to basically redraw the resources and sites in their neighborhoods. And I think this was really useful because it already sparked a very lively debate over which strategies would be most useful. So some, for example, argued that large-scale infrastructural investments would really only be possible with the generation of new revenue through investments like a transit mega hub or a tech campus for unicorn companies. Others argued that wealth creation measures needed to be focused mostly on the neighborhood's African American and Latina residents through avenues to land ownership and entrepreneurship. We also heard critiques of the way that tax funding flows in Oakland, right? That it bypasses, it sort of stems from new investments and then bypasses the neighborhood back out to the rest of the city. So I'm going to come back to most of these challenges in a moment, but I will just say that as an immediate response, we then came back to the third stakeholder meeting with a new set of adaptation pieces that reflected these conversations. So for example, we created policies that were shown by this string, and these could be applied to different zones in the neighborhood. And that included a public benefits zone that would basically help to capture income from future investments or future developments, and then keep them local and kind of controlled through a public budgeting process. So through this process, we defined the game as a contest among 7 players. The 7 players representing different stakeholder interests across the area. So the players were East Oakland residents, City of Oakland, Alameda Island, which is a neighboring kind of bedroom community, developers, airport, utilities, and wildlife. And each player is basically given a card that identifies their unique goals. And then they need to place the adaptation pieces on the board in order to accomplish their goals. They have a set of coins and each adaptation piece costs a different amount, so they can only play a certain number of pieces at a time. And then we color-coded the pieces to reflect the different goals that each of these players have. So blue points to water flood protection devices. Green creates new landscapes and sometimes transit connections. Yellow shows kind of economic boosting devices. Red especially focus on social justice, and orange talks about governance. So across this whole field, there are these kind of contentions where some players have tensions between them and other players have differences, and they all kind of overlap in different ways. So for example, the City of Oakland is much more focused on long-term flood protection, whereas the Oakland resident is much more focused on short-term creation of housing and wealth creation. Or in another kind of contest, the airport player wants to bar habitat creation for wildlife because there could be bird strikes with the airplanes. But of course, the animal player wants to create this habitat. So actually one night the airport player basically like overcame the wildlife player to convince all of the other players to pass a kind of wetland creation, like an anti-wetland creation policy. And then in exchange for this, he actually donated his money to the other players' flood protection investments. So there are these kind of jockeying, like they jockey for position along the way. But as I said, there are also a lot of overlaps. So for example, the developer player wants to cultivate new landscapes to add value to his or her investments. And this overlaps with the residents' need to improve air quality. And of course, the wildlife players need to create new habitat. And since one player's moves score goals for all of the other players at the same time, there's an incentive to kind of negotiate or deflect or just at least pay attention to what the other players are doing. Another important element of the game is that what you can see over here, there's an abacus for resilience points. So every time someone places a piece down on the board, a corresponding resilient point is accrued. So the resilience points are also color coded for economic, environmental, social justice, and governance criteria. So in this sense, winning can be defined in several different ways. And basically there are three possible outcomes to the game, any of which can occur at any time. So in a win-lose scenario, one player completes his or her goals before any of the others do. In a lose-lose scenario, everything floods. And then in a win-win scenario, all of the players together win by accruing all of the possible resilience points in the abacus. So for example, if all the players can convince each other to pitch in together, they can create a living levee loop that you see right here that basically protects the whole bay from flooding. This sounds very optimistic, but it's not always. There was one time that I think of as like the perfect demonstration of the concept of the tyranny of the majority, in which players basically passed a policy that forced the East Oakland player to pay a tax for the living levee loop. So even though that player didn't want to contribute, the others sort of forced that player to do so. Interestingly, in that case, the East Oakland player won because she partnered up with a developer player to kind of direct their investments in a way that was useful for them. In another case, so maybe to give an example of a less contested version, all of the players pooled their coins together in the middle of the board and just created a group pile of resources. And then they created a public benefit zone with a solar farm in it. And that allowed them to make profit off of the solar farm, but keep all of the profits from that within their community. They won so much profit, they were able to protect the whole bay in one round before sea level rise could even strike. So anyway, I think this can give you a sense of some of the kind of contestations and alliances that the game reveals. We often ask players to play a stakeholder or a perspective that they do not experience, so that they can start to build empathy and kind of an understanding for other people's perspectives. I'd also like to say a little bit about how the game relates to other methods of analysis as well. One of the members of our team is an urban economist. His name is Paul Penninger at AECOM. And he created this tool that's basically a triple bottom line style calculator. What that means is that if the typical bottom line of any proposed development tends to be profit, triple bottom line analysis looks not just at profit, but also at impacts for ecology and equity. And then we also added a fourth category of governance. And what this tool allows people to do is that they can input, it's basically a spreadsheet, and you can input proposed moves like 1 mile of living levee, or 3 affordable housing projects with 50 units in them each. You can input these tools, these inputs, this information, sorry, and then the Excel sheet will give you a pie chart that looks like this, that explains to you how your proposal is doing according to those 4 criteria of economy, ecology, equity, and governance. And so what I thought was really exciting about this is that so many planners and developers and policymakers in city agencies and major design firms are making decisions according to this method of analysis. So what you can do is you can play the game and you can have this kind of conversational way of talking about these issues, but then you can also open up this spreadsheet and understand how it influences some of the more quantitative logics behind decision making. Over the last few months of RBD, of the design challenge, we worked very closely with our partners to refine this board game. And then since then, we've played it about 20 times, a bit more, with East Oakland residents, with middle school students, with planners at sustainability conferences, at competition events, with students from the State Department, with my own students at California College of the Arts. I actually developed a kind of game show style of play where I could have like 30 people play the game all at one time in larger teams. And then we have the board up on the wall and kind of play sort of with each other in that way. It's really fun because everyone's part of the same experience. So I think it's been a kind of fun process of getting the word out. But also going back to this question about daylighting conflict that I opened my talk with, I've been really excited to see how the board game also has really allowed us to have a different kind of discussion than I think we would have if this were a more traditional design process. Um, and, I think there were issues that were genuinely hard to talk about and hard to know how to resolve. One of those, I think, sticky points of contention was this tension between development and gentrification, and the question about where the power to generate wealth stems from, right? So, like, I think initial attempts to navigate these differences really only just like magnified distrust and created further frictions. So, for example, there was this question about whether we should make a proposal for a community-owned solar installation, which is something that one of our community partners was really spearheading and already kind of working on themselves. But others were concerned that this would form competition with the local utilities company. And so that there's this kind of question, right, about whether the resource is owned locally or whether it's sort of this kind of corporate entity. This was hard to talk about. It was hard to find consensus around. But I think the game was really useful because it kept the debate live. It kept it in our focus, but it didn't require us to necessarily make a quick and therefore perhaps too exclusive decision about that. So we kept the conversation going and we could debate it. We could see the outcomes of one side or the other and try to loosen up play and conversation around that. In other ways too, the game, I think, allowed people to really exaggerate and kind of play in their own sense of role playing, right? So like neighborhood members would play the mayor, for example, and kind of play with this idea of how to get reelected. Others would anticipate really competitive moves, right? Like they would anticipate how the developer would seize land and then kind of profit off of it. And all of that, is kind of tense as it could often be, for us was a way of just exploring and seeing what possible outcomes could emerge. So I think in that sense, there's, the kind of ideological posturing that's so common in public processes really opened up as play and opened up as a different kind of conversation around very difficult issues. All right, so I think I'm going to close here with the In It Together game. And then I'd like to move on to the second game, which I mentioned, which is called Bartertown. And this game focuses a lot more on, I guess I could say that if In It Together was focused a lot more on the contestation between different urban stakeholders, Bartertown, I think, focuses much more on this idea of negotiation among an entangled public. And in the light of the COVID-19 crisis, I actually keep thinking about Bartertown, because although Bartertown was designed to think about how society reacts to sea level rise, it of course also reflects on how society responds to crisis in general. And this idea that we could rely on our neighbors or kind of, see how we depend on first responders and other members of our own community. I think, those issues have come to light through the COVID-19 crisis in a way that I think Bartertown is also interested in. So the background on this game is that I was asked to create the game for a state agency, a California state agency called Bay Conservation and Development Commission. That's BCDC. And they basically regulate the way that development can or cannot happen along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay waterfront. They've been working a lot on climate change adaptation, and they wanted to have a tool that would help them work with other city and state agencies and also kind of bring conversation to residents and members of the public. And amazingly, I thought they were such a fantastic client because they understood that we needed to daylight conflict. They knew that we needed to get to some of the hardest discussions and open them up for a more, as I said, playful discussion. They also wanted to emphasize that sea level rise doesn't just impact those low-lying areas that you can see on a flood map, but in fact have cascading chain reactions to the rest of a city. So for example, if your teacher can't get to school, the school can't function, right? We all know this now all too well. If the food supply chains are impacted by sea level rise, then this affects everybody, right? Not just those in those local areas. So these were some of the goals behind Bartertown. And this is the game that you can see here. Basically, it's called Bartertown because it imagines a world without money. And this is happening not necessarily because I'm trying to promote the idea of a world without money, but because when you take money away, you can start to see that one person does a favor for another, or one relies on another to do something for themselves. It's through these exchanges that we see how our society interacts. The premise of the game is that there are 5 players, each basically residents of Bartertown. They each need to perform daily chores by placing these colored tiles in rooms of corresponding colors around this board. And the board reflects different geographic conditions, roughly of the Bay Area, but also generically. So some have low-lying areas with lots of amenities. Others are more remote, but higher up, at higher elevation. Some have lots of work facilities. Others are very diverse. So you see these sort of different geographies reflected in the game. And then players might do things like they'd visit their grandma, they'd work in a hot sauce factory, they'd tutor local kids, they'd drink bubble tea. So they'd do these kinds of daily activities. And then they can trade favors with each other, like they can get a ride into town, or they could sleep on each other's couch if they can't get home. So this is how the kind of favors are exchanged. There are also risks. There's like a series of chance cards that you pull every round, and you could like get evicted for sharing your apartment illegally, or you can even get bed bugs by kind of, too close contact or something like that. So sharing has its risks and its rewards at the same time. And then the floods come. In fact, I will just switch over to a video to give you a little bit of a sense of how the game plays out. So right now they're kind of placing their pieces and trying to figure out where they want to go. Maybe I'll just let you watch a little bit. So now they're trying to decide how they want to, like where they want to play their game, their tiles and so on. And now a flood has come. So you can see that the flood comes and it starts to impact, like, for example, this tile is flooded, this tile is flooded, which means that, you're kind of penalized if your area gets flooded. But also it kind of blocks off different paths of transit. So some people might get stranded together in one area and not be able to kind of return back home or things like that. But the players also have these infrastructure tiles, which you see here. And the infrastructure tiles can be used to protect a property from flooding, or they can be used to create bridges across the bay or across the waterway. What you start to see, for example, in this particular game, a lot of the players pooled their resources and basically were able to create a new cluster of activities that they all kind of focused on together. In other cases, though, this dislocation of the board might force one person to kind of go off on their own and try to take care of themselves, while another one would kind of similarly kind of entrench, right, and kind of pull back into their own private world. So this question of how to cooperate or try to protect yourself is really part of the kind of fluid nature of the game. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the game. And since the original desktop or tabletop version that I just showed you, I've also developed the game in different ways. I exhibited it at a couple of different venues, and the Oslo Architecture Triennial at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts here in San Francisco, and with the Forecast Group in Berlin. So with each exhibition, I've kind of played out a number of different versions of the game. One of them was this set of pieces that I made for the Yerba Buena Center of the Arts exhibition, in which I made a couple of like alternate characters. So there's like a mountain lion, there's a worker character, and things like that. And then there are these pieces that basically allow you to like peel apart the building. So you can have like a bathroom that faces the outdoors, or this kind of playground feature that allows people to start to use the garden in different ways. So, although the original game I think was pretty sort of reduced in the way it understood the relationship between a room and a building and a site, these little pieces try to unpack some of those layers and try to show how architecture can make it possible for people to share more with each other or to be more reliant on each other. This shows the Oslo installation, in which I created a new version, which kind of lays out on the floor. And most importantly, for this version, I changed the characters and the powers of the characters. So although in the very first Bartertown game, all of the players have equal powers and equal identities, more or less, in the new version of the game, there are 5 different players that each have different powers. And in the spirit of Bartertown, none of them are monetary powers, but there are different sites of like leverage. And then again, in the spirit of Bartertown, you can see how these powers trade with each other. What I mean by that is that this player is the developer who has the power to own property, and charge others to use it. This player is the designer, and she has the power to connect buildings, or basically reconnect spaces to each other. This player is the nomad. He gets a divorce at the beginning of the game, loses his home, but has the power to move very quickly around the board and squat sites along the way. So he can actually start creating new homes or new stores or things like that. This player, the D player, is a caregiver and has the power of generosity. So he can invite others to stay in his home. His home gets much bigger than the others, and can give rides to other players, which is a huge bonus because once if they move together, they can actually cooperate with each other and therefore play more activity tiles. And then the last player is the politician, and she manages the distribution of resources. So she can take those infrastructure tiles that I described and basically tax the other players by seizing their infrastructure tiles and then, in doubling their value and then investing them. Or she can give like a tax break and kind of double her own tiles and give them out to the other players. Or she could like choose specific players and do a kind of tax benefit or sort of a tech boom benefit and sort of invest in certain players. So I hope that makes sense, but basically you can see how these players trade with each other. And here are the activity tiles that they get at the beginning of the game. And here are the little pieces that allow them to like squat or seize property or do things like that. So the way this has played out, it's just so fun to see how a game plays out. You never know what's going to happen. And I've seen many, many different outcomes so far. Amazingly, every player has won at least once. So the powers are somewhat equivalent. There have been some cases in which, for example, the developer player was able to seize very desirable tiles, ones that the other players badly needed. And that actually prompted the designer player to kind of sell out and expand that territory into like a mega structure that only the designer and the developer had access to, and they won the game. In other cases, though, generosity has proven to be very useful. And the caregiver that we're seeing here was able to kind of move people to new locations and work with a nomad player to kind of create a new city in a kind of very happy version of like a relocation or a kind of managed retreat. So we've seen very, very different pooling of activities, very, very different alliances, and very different geographic responses as well. Um, so I think I'm going to end here. I'm just going to skip over some of these slides. What I'm showing you here are some of the board games that my students have made over the years. And if you're interested in seeing those, you can always check them out at the Urban Works Agency website. But I want to close up and just talk a little bit about what board games do, and why I do them and why I think we could all think about both them and the way that we design in our own process as designers. And I think one of the things these games do is that they design interactions among players, objectives, resources, right? All of these very complex dynamics that we all connect to. And by modeling all these relationships, these games also model the social justice implications of new financial strategies, legal strategies, and spatial ideas. So, and as I said at the beginning, they basically model the city, right? But they model the city in a way that takes into account the economic forces and the ecological forces that really shape us all. So I would like to argue that the construction of knowledge, the construction of better tools in a risk society demands that we find a better way for deliberation, right? A better way through which we can sort of imagine possible futures, debate their consequences, form new alliances, and therefore really investigate the ethics of the way that we deal with climate risk and sort of other challenges that we all face. And I think doing so means that we have to start to bring very different values and very different incentives into a place of comparison. So we could look at, from economics to biology, across all of these different players and stakeholders with their varied interests. We need to find a way to have some kind of common space for conversation, if not a common space for agreement. And, I think doing so would, I hope, really bring in new players, right? It would exchange one kind of currency for another. It would test consequences, both kind and cruel. It would seek even the most difficult forms of cooperation. And hopefully, most of all, embrace the kind of surprising oddities or surprising conclusions that can come out of this process. So from this, again, just to visualize this connection between players, of currency, chance, and resources, all through the kind of space of the city, I think these are the kind of possibilities that are open to all of us. All right, so I think that's the end of my talk. I'm seeing a question come through. By the way, thank you for everyone who's here and who's listening. So I hear this question. Could you tell us how the situation with the coronavirus occurs in your city and country? And what do you think are the challenges the pandemic can cause for urban management? Should things like resilience be revised? It's an excellent question. Yeah, I think it's genuinely applicable. I think some of the questions about resilience to climate change relate very well to the question of resilience to this pandemic. Maybe we could think about this in a couple of ways, right? Like, of course, we are all inside and we have all been inside for a very long time. And perhaps the isolation we are feeling might feel like a retreat from society. But at the same time, I think, I don't know, I find a lot of excitement in realizing how much we value each other, right? I think we now see daycare in a different way than we did before. We appreciate the school teachers more than we did before. We understand how networks of care don't just exist through hospitals, but also exist through social ties, through people checking in on their neighbors, right? Through the kinds of relationships that we have socially. But they also point to the fact that we as a society need to value caregivers, right? Those people who make those connections happen and are reliant on them. So in a more immediate sense, what I'm hoping is that we can build resilience by valuing the social infrastructure that keeps our society going. And I think the COVID crisis has shown how important those alliances are. Mm, if those set of thoughts are a bit more local to our current condition, then maybe I could sort of bring back those things that I was saying about resilience at the beginning of my talk, right? That resilience is not just about being able to bounce back, but really has to be about looking at structural issues and looking for opportunities to rewrite them. And so there, I think, you know, in my particular country, our healthcare system, for example, is extraordinarily negligent in the way that our healthcare is tied to our jobs, and that if someone loses their job, they lose their healthcare at the same time. It's tragic. It's terrifying. So that's an example of a structural issue that I think the pandemic has revealed in a way that I hope we find some traction on. Um, so I think, and perhaps another structural question also would be, um, I think the way that our work world works, right? I think the gig economy has shown how vulnerable workers are, and I think points to the importance of union organization, but perhaps also as architects points to the idea that our work worlds, our home worlds, and our public worlds can't be segmented in quite the ways that we've seen so far. That maybe we can start to be more playful about seeing the overlaps that I think right now we struggle with, but are opening up really new territory. So thank you for your question. Perfect. So thank you for those of you who are listening, and thank you for CANactions for hosting the talk. Take care.